Believe you mentioned that Lucy Bell was half Indian?
I think Lucy's mother was. Her name was Mary, and it was a weird name. I can't remember the middle name. And just from the name, there's no pictures of her, obviously. Her husband was John Williams, and she was Mary. I don't know what her maiden name was, but from the description, I'm pretty sure she was part Indian.
Just one of the tribes along the Red
So I think
River?
Lucy could have been a fourth, maybe. Some kind of Indian. I don't know. I can't prove that, but when they didn't keep good records back then, they weren't real proud of it if they were part Indian. Now we want to be. All of us want to see if we're connected. I want to, I've been told I am, and when I did DNA, it said I wasn't, but the Indians don't do DNA. So you could be part Indian and never find it because it's, if they don't do DNA, it's not going to show up.
And they said that there was a burial mound near to the Bell farm.
That was over on John Sr.'s, and it was down close to the river. Junior owned, I guess a half a mile down there, all the way back across 41, and it kind of angled out toward Cedar Hill. And this was a part of the field here. We were trying to buy it. It was right in here between here and the cemetery, and we didn't buy it. But we had a meeting about it. And that night, after they decided it was going to cost too much, the guys that owned this said, "We've got 2 or 3 tombstones in our barn in Sadlersville, and we don't know who they are." And I said, "Man, I want to see those." So we got in the truck that night, and we had a big old light, and we dug the red clay off of it, and it was Richard Williams Bell from John Bell Sr. Cemetery. They had carried it out to Sadlersville where the Covingtons lived, and they rebacked it with a piece of granite, and it was heavy, and they couldn't probably pick it back up. It took 3 of us to get one end of it up, and they just left it in there.
Yeah.
So now we got Richard's stone back. I carried it in my truck for 2 or 3 years, and I finally told Bob Bell, I said, "Bob, I got to get that thing out of my truck." And so we took it to Cedar Hill and put it on the Bell farm with the others that are supposed to be put back over here. But in the meantime, I get a call from a lady in Nashville, or Goodlettsville, and she said, Bob Bell called me. He said, "I just got a call from a lady in Goodlettsville, and she was fixing a house over there, and they had stepping stones. And when she flipped over one of the stepping stones, it had Mary Ellen Bell Koch." And so she called the cave, and the caveman said, "I'll give her $100,000, and she didn't want to sell it. But he mentioned in the meantime Bob Bell at Austin and Bell, so she calls him, and the next morning she carried it up there, and Bob said, "I'm busy. I want you to meet her." And I did, and she had that stone in 2 pieces up against the side of her truck. And she was crying, and I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "Well, I lost a grandbaby 2 years ago, and I was just thinking if somebody stole that baby's stone." And she said, "I'm so upset." She said, "I didn't sleep a bit last night. Every time I go to bed, I come back, the television was on, the lights were back on." And she said, "I don't know what's happening." And I said, "Well, if I was really into the Bell Witch like a lot of people, I'd say that's what it was." But anyway, I got that stone, put it in my truck, and it and Richards rode with me for almost 2 years, 3 years. And I finally said, "I got to get those out of there. I can't hardly use my truck." So Bob took them at the funeral home, and then we moved them out here to the farm.
Behind this fence, Kate Batts is buried, and they say that she was kind of a poor woman in the community in a lot of the things I read about her, but she was a plantation owner and a slave owner as well. And she's buried in a cemetery on the property right beyond this gate in that little grove of trees. Got burial mounds, and you have this box graves.
Well, the Red River kind of encircles here, goes around Adams. And it's back in there behind the Bell farm. The Johnstons owned the farm over the hill where you see the trees there. The Porters evidently owned this. I guess they did. They buried their dead here. I never have looked up Frank Porter's records. I need to. But this whole area was important, and the Bells were on back further, but the Johnstons owned 440 acres or more right over the hill, which was a part of the original grant that his name was Arnold. And that John Bell bought 220 acres of it, and James Johnston bought the other 440. And then sometime later, I don't know where he bought it, John Bell added another 100 acres in 1815, 5 years before he died. So he had, when he died, 320 acres that was divided up between his wife and his children. She got 106 2/3 acres, and the children divided up the other 200 plus acres. among them, which means they didn't get much land. You know, there's so much discussion that John Jr. got, you know, Senior had 1,000 acres, he didn't. But the boys, that would be John Jr., that would be Drury, that would be Jesse, and Richard. Between them, they had about 1,800 acres through here. They had John's original farm, and then he bought land all around them. So the Bell sons were fairly wealthy. I said John Bell came in here and worked hard. His sons got rich, and his grandsons got drunk, because a lot of them ended up being alcoholics. And I don't know what that was all about, but third John was an alcoholic, and there was another one or two of them.
And on the land out here, I heard from some locals that you're still finding the box graves and the
Stone box burials, especially close to the river, but even up in here on some of the hills, they're almost hidden in disguise, and erosion sometimes will take it down a foot or two, and then you'll hit it with one of these rippers and knock a lid off, or even a plow if it washes away enough. They're usually pretty deep, and you can imagine using stone tools to dig a grave. I don't know how they did it. And then you carry those big slabs of limestone. Sometimes there's one across the bottom, and maybe two on the sides or three, and then the short ones on the end, and then they have a big slab on top of it, usually slanted one way or the other, I guess to keep the water from going directly in. But yeah, they're still here, and they found them all along the Red River, and because that was like I-24. Red River, you know, today we think about the road system. Back then they traveled the streams. Sometimes they used canoes, sometimes they walked them. And every little creek just about has some kind of village site somewhere up in here. If you see a tributary of Red River, you're going to find a campsite or a village site. And the later ones made pottery. I have a few pieces of broken pottery that came off near the Red River. And you'll find mostly arrowheads among the Mississippians. That's the last culture. The early ones had all kinds of spears and lance heads and you name it. But yeah, this was very important to the Indians. I'm surprised I can't see a piece of flint right here, and I haven't looked real hard. Do you have any luck?
Yeah, I found them.
Well, they're back there, but the one I'm talking about is right up in here somewhere laying down. It's probably about that deep under the who knows. We went by Kate's place, but it was down the road about a mile back up behind the Methodist church. This was a part of John Jr.'s land, and I'm sure they harvested trees. I think he or Jesse one got the barrel making tools, and if I did explain what a hogshead is, it's a barrel was yay big. A hogshead was huge, and it would hold up to 2,000 pounds of tobacco. Once they got it in there, it was basically airtight and moisture tight. You better have everything right. If it's too wet, it could rot. If it was too dry, it'd turn to powder. Then they could turn it up on the side and roll it on a wagon. They'd use the woods to cut logs, and then they would make staves. Of course, they burned wood back then. Probably no coal, because they could get access to coal here. In later years, some of the later Bells probably used coal. But
the property belonged to
John Bell Jr. owned all this in here. And this road was not here. I mean, the road to get into his property came down through that swamp down there.
I thought you were saying that one of the Bats married in with one of the Bells.
Well, that was that's on further down there, closer to the school. Bell Bats was the last man to own that property, and he had he was kin to the Bells. I don't know if he had an actual Bell or it was a Williams, because Lucy was a Williams, and he may have come through that. But he was a cousin to the Bells because of his mother and Lucy's, they were Williamses. And then they were so proud of it, they called him Bell Bats. His name was really Obadiah Bell Bats, but his pet name was Bell. And when he was mayor of Adams for about 10 or 12 years, he was called Bell Bats. And I have some of his information there. He died, I want to say, in the late 30s. And is buried, I don't know where he's buried, to be honest with you. I think he's buried up there by the Baptist church.
But would you say that the Bats family and the Bell family kind of had one of those feuds?
If you read the books, you know, they separate Kate and Frederick from Benjamin and Jeremiah. Truth is, when I looked into it, Frederick, her husband, was a brother to Jeremiah and Benjamin. And because supposedly the legend was so bad in the temperament between Kate and John, Kate Bats was Lucy Bell's aunt, and she was about the same age as Lucy Bell. No, she was a niece, I'm sorry. Her daddy was was William Batts, I think. And it says in the book she loved Lucy and hated John. Now I don't know what that was all about. You can come up with whatever reason you want. And then they separate her and her husband from all the other the Batts because of the supposed problems between them. I don't know how serious it was. Truth is, I can't find Kate as a member of the Red River Baptist Church of Christ. I don't think she was. But and the only Bell that I could find in the early days was John. And you say, well, they just didn't list them. Well, they listed everybody. They listed slaves that were members. Lucy was not a member of the Baptist Church, or whatever they wanted to call it back then. And first one I can find is a grandson in 1860 who was a member for a short time, less than a year, and then he was kicked out for being a drunkard. And that was a grandson. His name was John Bell Jr. from Junior. You had John Bell Sr., he died, and John Bell Jr. became senior. And then his son, John Bell Jr., I call him Third John to keep him straight, but he was a member for a short time, and then they kicked him out. It was very common back then. And then the next one I find, Joel is a member of the Springfield Baptist Church when he died in 1890. But I can't find Jesse as a member of any of them, and turns out that most of the Bell grandchildren were Methodists. So that's why I think Lucy was probably a Methodist. I know Elizabeth, her sister, was. I know her nephew, Jeremiah Batts Jr. was. Jeremiah Batts Sr. was a Baptist. The Jr. was a Methodist. So I'm thinking that there were a lot of Methodists, and the reason, the Bell boys, 3 of them married Gunn girls. Their daddies were Thomas and James Gunn, who were Methodist preachers. So I tell people most of John Bell's grandchildren were sons of Gunns, and they were. And the wives were strictly Methodist. And even to this day, when you find descendants, most of them are Methodists. They were strong. I don't know why John didn't have as much influence, but I didn't know back then that women had the influence that they did. Evidently, they could. They had power more than I realized. Book by Dr. Charles Bailey Bell, and it's an original printing from 1930, what was it, 34. This came out of New York, and it had the note still in there, but we copied one of the grandsons or granddaughters or whatever of Joel, or Richard Bell, Richard Bell had written in there, and we paid $100 for it, but I would have been glad to have done that because of historical significance. You can still find them, but one that's got the note in it and everything.
Yeah. It's crazy how many Bells are still in the local area.
Well, there's not many left. Bob is really it. He owns Austin Bell Funeral Home. There are Bells here that are not connected with John.
Why do you think they would move here? Just because of all the legends
Well,
surrounding?
they were here before. John Bell came here in 1805, and there were several families of Bells here before him that I can't connect up to him. They could be kin somewhere back there, but John Bell came in here with his children, ranging in age from adults down to the younger one was Joel, born in 1811. Actually, 3 of his children were born after they moved in 1805, and that would be Betsy in 1806, I believe I'm right, and then Richard, who was born in 1809, and then the last one was Joel in 1811. The baby died in 1890, and he's buried. Well, we just moved him to Bellwood. He was buried near Springfield on his farm. And 2 of his wives, he had 2 wives. One died, who knows, childbirth, or then he married a second wife. He had 11 or 13 kids. I'm trying to think now. I'd have to look in my book.
That would explain why there were so many for a long time.
Well, I mean, there was no stopping it now, you know. Cold winter and you got another baby coming. You know?
Well, there's I've noticed when you see the Sugg family or the Batts family or the Bell family, was it almost a clan type structure like Scotland?
Well, what I think probably happened, you got one family discovered the area, and then kinfolk started moving in here. The Forts came in here in the 1790s. They weren't the first people here, and they were instrumental in, they didn't establish the Red River Baptist Church of Christ, but they were some of the early members. And then next thing you know, you got Sugg, and the Forts intermarried with the Sugg. And I don't know if the Bells intermarried with them or not. Now there are kinfolk to the Bells that live here now that don't carry the Bell name. Bob is the last of the line. He is descended from Joel, which was the baby. But Jesse is almost old enough, the oldest boy, to be the father of Joel. Not quite, but and his descendants are 6 or 7 generations deep. And Joel's most of them are a generation or two less because he was so much younger. Jesse ends up moving to Mississippi, and his descendants are scattered everywhere, but there's still some down in Mississippi. Joel stayed here and became quite wealthy, either married up or made his money and lived here. And his son, C.C. Bell, I've been excited to find him, and he's kin to Bob Bell. Had a tobacco factory in Springfield about 1890s till the Tobacco War, and he turned out to be an independent. His warehouse went up. The local history says it was an accident, sparks from a train passing in the night. I think it may have been sparks from the night riders passing in the night.
And he would have been one of the hillbillies, right?
He got out of the business, either got scared or whatever. Somebody else had taken it over at that point, but he was still associated with it, and it would buy an independent. They call it independent, we've talked about a while ago, association with the unionizers, the night riders. Independents were the hillbillies. They didn't call themselves hillbillies. That's the derogatory word that the association night riders put on them. And they're usually in groups. If you find, and they'll have a church in the center of it. That's probably where they met. And whatever the hierarchy of that community, whichever way they went, then that's the general area went the same way. That's how you end up with a hillbilly community right next to a night rider community, which is what Adams was. And when I was writing my little book, I was told by one of the local historians, well, this was association country. There were no hillbillies here. Well, I got looking into it. They were here. And they didn't just fool with tobacco. One man was down here thrashing wheat on the other end of town, and he was thrashing he was an independent. Ben Sawyer was the head of that bunch, and it was his thrashing machine along with somebody else owned it too. They blew it up. That pretty well fixed it. And they had the independents, the hillbillies had 3 guards, but they were overpowered. And they put dynamite under the business end of it, and that was the end of the thrashing. And that really set them off. And Mr. Ben Sawyer was on the train from Springfield riding either to Adams or Sadlersville, who knows. He had a warehouse here. And he ran into Mr. Joel Fort, who was a lawyer for the association. Now again, think about the hierarchy. They didn't claim that they had anything to do with the night riding, but they knew about it. I think they backed it. But anyway, Ben saw him, and they got into it on the train. Of course, Ben was a rugged man. He had been sheriff of Robeson County. He was just a tough man, and he got the better of the lawyer. I mean, bloodied noses and whatever. I don't know how far it went after that, and then there was really an enemy here. In the early days, Ben Sawyer's warehouse was up here where Adams Station Barbecue is now. It was right on that little corner. And the, the night riders tried to shut it down in the middle of the day. About 250 came up one day, and Ben Sawyer had 30 workers. And there's a picture, one bad picture of them all standing around. He had them all armed. Every one of them had at least 1 or 2 weapons. And after he began to talk with the forts and whoever else were in charge, they raised up in the windows and the doors with all the guns, and they had protection. All these other guys were on horses outside. They retreated back up the street, but it was a short time after that they burned it down in the middle of the night and burned it, and the mayor's house got burned because it was too close, and then another house or 2. All this is in a Hopkinsville newspaper. I couldn't find any records here by design. And everybody, the old people would say, to keep me from aggravating them, well, it accidentally burned down. Well, when I got to the Hopkinsville newspaper, it named names and said, no, it wasn't no accident. The night riders did it.
Well, it's crazy how much history and conflict is in a community this small. There was a full-scale war.
It was, and tobacco's big business. Understand here, you had some cows and you might have had hogs, you ate those, and you made very little money on your animals and maybe even corn. But tobacco, that's how you survive. If it was good, the preacher got paid good. If it was good, the teachers got their money. If it was a bad price, which it got, that's what caused the war, then nobody was happy. The farmer couldn't pay his bills at the store, and back then they'd run them a year. You know, if a farmer was in good standing, he'd run at the general store or the grocery store, whatever you want to call it. He'd run a bill for a year, and then he'd pay it off when he sold his tobacco. Well, suddenly, tobacco sold and didn't have enough money to pay the grocery off.
Right.
And they wouldn't put money in the collection plate, and the preacher was upset. So he took sides too. You know, he took sides with the one that could pay him. So that's what 1904 is when they unionized in Guthrie, Kentucky. But when I got to looking into it, they had been working on it for like 3 years. 1901 was the first time it had a major meeting here, and it was called the Robertson County Association or whatever. Well, within a year they combined and had 8 counties, and then another 2 or 3 years went by, and they had the whole end of Tennessee and Kentucky at Guthrie, and there was 5,000 of them meeting up there. That's pretty powerful. The second year there was 25,000 farmers showed up, and they had a power source. And the discussion was, well, the leaders like Mr. Ford, Charlie, and Felix Ewing, who was really the power behind the throne. I need to show you his house out there. You won't believe it. It's huge. Took 5 years to build the blank thing. But they still couldn't get everybody. But I've read some internal memos where they said, well, you know, Joe over here, he's our next door neighbor, but he has not joined the association. They said, well, just go over and give him a little encouragement. And then if that didn't work, a few months later, they'd go and burn a barn or two.
Yeah.
If that didn't work, and he would either leave the country or he became armed just like the Night Riders did. And hillbillies rode here. I read books out of Hopkinsville. They said, well, the hillbillies didn't ride. They just kind of protected. Here, they met over here at Sturgeon Creek. We got records of them. And they went out and did some damage themselves. And it was kind of revenge in there. So it was very serious here. It was big money is what it was. And you'll still see a few plantation houses around. A lot of them are gone because of age and burning down. But when a man had 500 or 1,000 acres, he might have 10 or 15 men working for him, and they depended on tobacco.